They fired me in a cold conference room with a few polished sentences. As if I were nothing more than a cost line that needed to disappear from a spreadsheet. No one thanked me. No one asked what I was holding together. No one remembered that I was the only person who could speak to our Gulf partners in the language. Culture. And trust they respected. By the time the delegation from the Emirates walked into that meeting room and asked for me by name, the company finally understood something far too late. Some bridges, once cut down, cannot be rebuilt with slide decks. Vague apologie. Or a better compensation offer. The calendar invite appeared in my inbox at 8:46 on a Thursday morning. So bare, it almost felt insulting. No subject line. No context. Just a required meeting in conference room 5B. The sender was not my direct manager. Not anyone from the executive team I worked with. Not even a person with the courtesy to attach a name to the decision. It came from a general administrative address. The kind of faceless mailbox companies use when no one wants their fingerprints on what is about to happen. I stared at it for a few seconds. And a quiet part of me already knew this was not a strategy session. It was not a client update. It was not a routine alignment call. It was too sudden. Too clean. Too silent. The worst things in corporate life rarely arrive with noise. They arrive as empty calendar invites, closed conference rooms, and faces trained not to show emotion. At exactly 9, I walked in. Grant Miller was already seated, his suit pressed, one hand resting on a folder, like he was preparing to read a sentence instead of speak to a colleague. Paige Nolan from Human Resources sat beside him. Spine straight, eyes avoiding mine for more than a second at a time. I pulled out the chair and sat down without waiting to be invited. Placed my bag beside my foot. And folded my hands in my lap. I did not ask what was happening. Because women in corporate rooms learn early that sometimes a question only gives someone more room to lie politely. I had been at Northbridge Systems long enough to recognize the scent of a decision that had been made before I entered. What hurt was not simply that they wanted me gone. What chilled me was how confidently they believed they could remove me without understanding what I had been holding in place. Grant began with a soft voice. The kind weak leaders use when they want cruelty to sound professional. He said Northbridge Systems was restructuring to better support future growth, streamlining its operating model, and reallocating resources to optimize long-term value. I listened to each phrase land on the table. Hollow, as paper being crushed in a closed room. None of it meant anything human. It was the language of spreadsheets, presentation decks, and people who believe that if a decision is wrapped in enough formal vocabulary, ingratitude becomes strategy. Then he said, my role had been impacted, not eliminated, impacted, as if some weather event had passed through the building and accidentally blown me out of my seat. Rather than the company choosing to push me out, Paige slid an envelope across the table. Inside were the exit details, the severance information, and one generic line, thanking me for contributions rendered. I looked at that envelope and thought about the nights I had worked across time zones. The calls that lasted until my throat went dry. The Arabic language contracts I had just finished reviewing. The agreements carrying more than $20 million in long-term renewal value. No one mentioned them. No one spoke about the crises I had contained before leadership even realized they existed. No one asked who would handle the Emirati delegation arriving Monday morning. Grant kept talking, but his voice blurred. In my mind, only one fact remained clear. They had not evaluated my performance. They had not consulted regional partners. They had not mapped the relationships or the risk. They had looked at a cost sheet and decided I was a column they could delete. That was the moment I understood how dangerous their ignorance really was. They were not just cutting an employee. They were cutting context, continuity, and credibility. Then calling it efficiency because the consequences had not yet arrived. I glanced at Paige. She looked down at the table, lips pressed together, like someone who could see the wrongness of the moment, but did not have the courage to interrupt it. I did not fully blame her, but I did not absolve her either. In rooms like that, silence is not neutral. Silence is an invisible signature beneath a cowardly decision. Grant continued talking about modernization, efficiency, and strategic reallocation. While I thought of the Emirati delegation that would land on Monday, the legal advisors who had learned to open their messages by calling me a shield of judgment, the negotiations where a single wrong phrase in English could undo months of trust, they thought I simply spoke Arabic. But I did not merely speak a language. I spoke context. I knew when a sentence needed to soften, when a clause had to be reframed to protect a partner's dignity, when a delay was not avoidance but a counsel's way of preserving face before reaching agreement. None of that appeared in my job description. None of it appeared on the organization chart. None of it turned green on a dashboard. But it was why money kept flowing into the company. I did not argue. I did not ask them to reconsider. I did not cry in front of them, even though something in my chest tightened like a door closing from the inside. I took the envelope, stood, smoothed the edge of my blazer, and looked directly at Grant. He avoided my eyes. He always avoided what he did not understand. If you have ever been underestimated, replaced, or treated as if your work did not matter. Comment number 1, so I know you understand that feeling too. I said only one thing, good luck. Then I walked out. Not because I had lost, but because I knew they had just done something that no apology would easily repair. When the elevator doors closed behind me, I did not feel relieved, and I did not feel destroyed. I felt a clean emptiness, like standing near a cliff and suddenly hearing the wind below. I had worked at Northbridge Systems long enough to know how they like to rename things until the truth disappeared under polished language. Firing people became workforce adjustment. Cutting experience became modernization. Throwing away a strategic relationship became resource reallocation. But no matter how many elegant phrases they layered on top, the reality remained. They had cut down the only bridge connecting them to a market they had never bothered to respect. I walked through the familiar hallway where I had spent so many mornings carrying coffee and reading messages from Doha before the domestic team was awake. I passed the glass walls, the mounted signage, and people moving through their day without knowing a crack had opened beneath the company floor. No one stopped me. No one asked whether I needed to hand anything over. No one requested contact lists, regional notes, cultural briefings, sensitive translations, or the status of each negotiation. Their carelessness almost made me laugh. They believed my work lived in the system. They thought relationships could be downloaded, trust could be forwarded by email, and nuance could be replaced by someone younger with prettier software. I stepped out of the building and drew in a long breath. The weather was ordinary that day, but to me it felt like a heavy door had finally fallen off its hinges. I had no revenge plan. I only had a cold certainty they did not yet know what they had lost. And when an organization fails to understand the value of what it holds, it usually realizes only after its hands are empty. I walked away with the strange calm of someone who had been removed from a building but not from her own worth. The funniest part was that during all my years there, no one had ever truly asked how I secured the Gulf contracts in the first place. Not during onboarding. Not during performance reviews. Not even when renewals began stacking so reliably that finance treated them like a natural rhythm of the business. To them, it simply happened. Middle Eastern clients signed, expanded, referred others. And I was the quiet woman conveniently attached to the miracle. Trusted enough to carry the work, but not visible enough to protect. They did not know about the time zone calls I took late at night while the streetlights glowed outside my window. They did not know that some legal phrases, if translated directly, could damage goodwill. While the right phrasing could save an entire negotiation cycle, they did not know I had spent 3 years in Sharjah. 2 of them inside a logistics firm, learning the hidden layers of maritime routing codes, trade etiquette, and the thin line between firm negotiation and disrespect. They never read the Arabic annotations I wrote in contract margins. Not to decorate the document, but to make sure the agreement passed not only legal review, but the honor test on both sides. They saw 3 accounts under my name and assumed my work was translation, email forwarding, scheduling, and coordination. They did not see compliance protection, real-time clause negotiation, cross-border risk awareness, or the ability to read the temperature of a room half a world away. If this story reminds you that some people quietly keep entire systems standing, please like the video. Sometimes the person mentioned the least is the person preventing everything from falling apart. That was what Northbridge never understood. They mistook silence for simplicity. They confused my lack of self-promotion with a lack of power. They never asked what I did because the results arrived too smoothly. And smooth results make careless. Leaders believe the machine runs by itself. That evening, I did not open the severance envelope. I placed it on the kitchen table beside a chipped ceramic mug and left it there like a foreign object that did not have the right to define my mood. I did not reread the email. I did not scroll through old messages. I did not draft a long post for social media. There was anger in me. Of course there was. But it did not burn upward. It sat deep, heavy, and awake. I knew that if I let anger lead, they would remain the center of my story. And after everything, I was tired of orbiting people who recognized my value only when it served them. On the first day after being fired, I did something ordinary. I cleaned my apartment. I vacuumed under the sofa, wiped the counters, and opened every window to let fresh air move through. There was a strange stability in those small acts. When your career has just been swept out of a building with a few cold sentences, cleaning your own space reminds you that some places still belong to you. I did not cry, but I also did not force myself into a performance of strength. I allowed myself to feel insulted, erased, dismissed. Then I set each feeling down, like folding separate sheets of paper. I had built bridges no one saw. I had maintained relationships no one credited. If they did not understand that, it was a measure of their limitation, not proof of my smallness. Night settled quietly around the apartment. I sat by the window and watched the city shift color. And for the first time in years, I did not have to calculate the time in Riyadh, who was waiting for my reply, or which clause needed to be softened before sending. Silence no longer felt like punishment. It began to feel like new territory. By Saturday, I pulled every binder from my shelf. They were not glamorous objects. They were thick, worn binders labeled by region, client, regulation type, and sensitivity level. In an age when everyone assumes all knowledge belongs in the cloud, I still kept handwritten notes because some legal and cultural nuances cannot be found through a search bar. I sat cross-legged on the rug and opened each one as if I were reopening pieces of a life the company had treated as overhead. Some pages were tied to deals that never closed. Some drafts never became contracts. Some notes were only a few lines long. But behind them were weeks of listening, adjusting, and finding language that allowed no one to lose face. I touched my own handwriting and realized something that hurt and warmed me at the same time. All of this was mine. Not company property in the legal sense, but mine in the deeper sense. Skill, memory, judgment, instinct, and discipline built over years. Northbridge could take back my access card. They could lock my email. They could remove my name from the employee directory. But they could not confiscate how I read a room. How I heard hesitation in a partner's voice. How I knew when silence preserved respect better than another sentence. A few notes brought back nights of exhaustion. Moments when I had defended a clause between two sides that did not want to yield. I used to believe that if I performed well enough for long enough, someone would notice. Now I understood that doing good work was not only about being seen by them, it was about remaining intact when they looked away. That intactness was becoming the foundation of whatever came next. Sitting there on the floor, surrounded by the architecture of knowledge no one had bothered to value. I felt the first real shift inside me. They had removed me from their company, but they had not removed the system I carried within me. On Sunday afternoon, the first real email arrived. It was not from Grant, not from Paige, and not from anyone at Northbridge pretending to care. It came from Ethan Ward, the founder of Virion Analytics, a mid-sized healthcare analytics company I had met at a conference 2 years earlier. I remembered Ethan because he was one of the few executives who did not ask hollow questions. While others wanted only to know how much revenue the Gulf market could produce, he asked, how organizations there made decisions, how trust was built, and how healthcare technology needed to adapt to local language, authority, and dignity. At the time, Virion Analytics was not large enough to compete directly with Northbridge. They did not have enormous budgets, polished global programs, or conference rooms decorated with slogans. But they had something rarer, genuine curiosity. Ethan's email was short. He had heard what happened, said Virion was building something sharper, and asked whether I wanted to lead it. I read it twice. Not because I was unsure, but because after years surrounded by empty corporate language, a clear invitation almost felt unfamiliar. I replied immediately. We scheduled a call for Monday. While Northbridge prepared for the Emirati meeting without understanding that I had designed the foundation beneath it, I opened Virion's current infrastructure files. They were unfinished. There were gaps. Some parts were rough, but they were honest. And more importantly, they were ready to be rebuilt properly. If you want more stories about women who were underestimated and then rebuilt their own place, subscribe to the channel now. I was not looking back to beg for an old seat. I was beginning to build my own table. And that difference mattered. I did not want revenge. I wanted room to do meaningful work without the pretense, without circular meetings, and without men who used vague language to cover empty judgment. By Monday morning, I knew Northbridge was being dangerously confident. I could imagine them polishing the glass conference room, changing the slide deck one last time, ordering tea, coffee, and food labeled as culturally appropriate, as if those surface details could replace the trust they had thrown out the door on Thursday. I was not there, but I had prepared enough meetings like that to see the scene clearly in my mind. 4 black cars would pull into the circular entrance. The Emirati delegation would step out. Calm, composed, and able to quiet a lobby without raising a voice. Leading them was Karim Al-Nasser, the senior partner, accompanied by 2 advisors and 1 interpreter. I knew his manner. When he arrived on time, he was prepared to stay and discuss. When he arrived early, he wanted to observe who was about to embarrass themselves. Inside the room, Grant probably stood slightly off-center, arms crossed in the posture of a man who believed stance could substitute for competence. Margaret Hayes was not there, perhaps too senior to attend, or too smart to witness the outcome. Karim did not sit. The interpreter did not sit either. He placed both hands on the back of a leather chair and asked directly, "Where's Amelia Brooks?" I heard the story later from several people, but the moment I learned it, I could feel the room drop. Grant must have blinked. He probably forced a smile. He may have tried to pivot toward the new team, the new process, the new capability. But in relationships built on trust, a name is not an administrative detail. A name is assurance. And the only assurance Northbridge had was the woman they had just fired. That single question exposed everything their restructuring plan had failed to measure. They had prepared flowers, slides, catering, and talking points. They had not prepared an answer for the only thing that mattered. Grant told Karim that I was no longer with the company, but that the project had been reassigned to a fully capable team. I could almost hear the crack in that sentence, though I was not in the room. Fully capable, in Northbridge language, often meant someone willing to accept responsibility without understanding the risk. The room went still. The interpreter said nothing. Karim's advisors did not step in. It was the kind of silence that needs no raised voice because silence itself has already judged the room. Karim did not argue. He did not slam a fist on the table. He did not demand a long explanation that Grant could later recast as cultural misunderstanding. He simply gave a slight nod to his advisors, spoke 1 sentence in Arabic, and straightened. The meeting ended before it truly began. Grant tried to say something about continued dialogue, long-term partnership, and opportunities to realign, but some doors, once closed, do not allow sound through. At the doorway, Karim turned once and said in English that trust was not a resource to be reallocated. Then they left. No shouting, no slammed doors, only presence turning into absence. And that absence weighed more than any confrontation could have. When I heard about it, I did not feel petty satisfaction. I felt a cold confirmation. Northbridge had confused the person doing the work with the structure containing the work. They thought a logo, a conference room, and a polished presentation would make partners stay, but in large agreements, especially across cultures, the person who keeps faith often matters more than the place where promises are printed. They had removed that person from the room. They had mistaken ceremony for credibility. And when the moment came, the room had everything, except the one thing the delegation had actually come to find. I did not hear about the collapse through official channels. Northbridge loved its image too much to admit that kind of failure in a company-wide email. I heard it through ripples. Small pieces of truth slipping through cracks that a panicked organization could not seal quickly enough. Rachel Price, from legal, sent me 3 words. They walked out. Victor Lane left a voicemail. I never returned. His voice heavy, as he said they should have known. Sophie Reed sent me a screenshot of Grant standing frozen behind the glass wall, watching the cars leave, while an international contract worth $24 million disappeared from reach. Not delayed. Not renegotiated. Gone. There was no internal announcement that day. No all-hands meeting. No transparent explanation for employees. Only a closed-door meeting that began before noon and ran until late afternoon. Where, according to what I heard, everyone had an excuse, and no one had a plan. What they could not put in the minutes was simple. They were not prepared to lose me because they had never bothered to understand that I mattered. My name was not on the company homepage. I was not featured in leadership slides. I was not the person standing center stage during revenue announcements. But I was inside the clauses being weighed. The email threads that had to be read between meetings. The decisions made behind closed doors in Dubai, Doha, and Riyadh. The real work I did became visible only when no one was left to do it. And now, in a conference room with untouched tea, cooling, pastries, and chairs no one had used, Northbridge finally received the market's most honest feedback without her. We do not trust you. That was the kind of response no public relations team could soften. It was not emotional. It was not dramatic. It was surgical, which made it worse. The first message from them arrived on Wednesday. It was short, hurried, and unsigned, asking whether I could schedule a call regarding a few recent developments. Recent developments? I read the phrase and set my phone down. I did not respond. Not because I wanted to be difficult, but because after being pushed out of a room without one decent question, I no longer had an obligation to step back in just because they were beginning to feel cold. The second message was longer and more formal. This time from Grant's executive assistant. He wanted to personally connect about potential strategic consulting options and would greatly value my insight. Insight. It was strange how something cut from payroll in less than 10 minutes had suddenly become valuable insight. I did not respond. My silence was not a game. It was a boundary. When you have been erased from email chains, excluded from any handover plan, and packaged into a human resources envelope, you learn that speech is not the only way to protect yourself. Silence has its own grammar. Silence can say, I have heard enough. Silence can say, you do not get to call me only when you need saving. Silence can say, I am no longer waiting to be chosen. By Thursday, Grant called. I let it ring until voicemail. His voice was thin and strained. The voice of someone trying to sound composed while the ceiling begins to fall. He said the company may have acted somewhat prematurely, and that there was strong interest in re-establishing a collaborative relationship. He did not say mistake. He did not say sorry. Only prematurely. As if firing me had been an experiment scheduled slightly wrong. I deleted the voicemail after listening once. That was enough. I had no interest in translating his panic into accountability for him. On Friday morning, I updated my LinkedIn profile, not with a new title, not with a polished post about fresh beginnings. I changed only one small thing. I set my visibility to private. No profile photo. No contact information. No description line for them to cling to. Just an absence, polite enough that no one could call it revenge. but clear enough for the panic to understand that access had ended. The third email arrived after that, carrying a vague offer of compensation flexibility. I did not open the attachment. Some doors close so completely inside you that your hand no longer wants to touch the handle. I already had a better view, a better plan, and most importantly, a better place to put my skills. Virion Analytics did not ask whether I could temporarily patch a relationship for them. They asked what I would build if I were allowed to do it correctly from the start. That was not merely a management difference. It was a difference in how people are seen. Northbridge saw me as legacy, a cost attached to old processes. Virion saw the architect of a new capability. When an organization recognizes your value only after losing you, that is not recognition. It is consequence. I did not want to return just to teach them a lesson they should have learned long ago. I did not want to be invited back as a fire extinguisher, only for them to pretend nothing happened once the smoke cleared. I had spent too many years maintaining bridges for other people to cross. Now I wanted to decide which bridges deserved my steps. This time, I was not moving because I feared losing a place. I was moving because I finally understood my place was not in a room that had erased my name. That realization did not make me cruel. It made me clear. They did not get a casual meeting with me. They received a consulting agreement drafted through my attorney, reviewed by an outside compliance advisor they did not know, and delivered to Northbridge Legal and Language, so precise, no one could misinterpret it. That was intentional. I gave them no opportunity to pull me back into familiar rhythms, old hallways, urgent Slack messages, fake greetings as if that Thursday had been only an administrative misunderstanding. I was not offering employment. I was offering containment. The agreement stated scope, boundaries, duration, and autonomy. They could access my analysis, not my allegiance. I would not report to Grant. I would not attend internal briefings. I would not train whoever they hired to replace me. I would advise from a distance, surgically, at twice the rate they used to pay me, and only until the contract expired. The first clause prevented automatic extension. The second gave me control of the timeline. I worked when I chose, where I chose, and only on documentation directly facing clients. No performative strategy meetings. No brand syncs. No artificial deadlines built to reassure investors. They accepted every term within 48 hours. Not because they had suddenly learned respect, but because they had no leverage left. The Gulf clients were not answering their calls. 3 contracts were frozen mid-renewal. One strong partner in Abu Dhabi had already begun exploratory conversations with Virion Analytics. My new company. I did not mention that to Northbridge. I did not need to. The panic inside their polished emails said everything. For the first time, they had to engage with my work on terms I chose. That mattered. It meant they could no longer consume my judgment as if it were an endless internal utility. If they wanted access, they would pay, wait, and remain outside the boundary I had drawn, while Northbridge tried to patch what it had broken. Ethan brought me into 2 major expansion initiatives at Virion Analytics. From the first meeting, I felt the difference. No one called Arabic a barrier. No one treated the Gulf as a complicated appendix to a global plan. They called it an advantage, then asked what I needed to turn that advantage into an operating foundation. I nearly paused, because after years of explaining why cultural context was not decorative, hearing the right question made me feel both relieved and sad. Sad, because I realized I had become so used to being minimized that basic respect felt unfamiliar. We were not merely translating interfaces. We were redesigning workflows to reflect how healthcare organizations in the region approved decisions, reconciled authority, protected data, and preserved accountability before councils. I built bilingual documentation frameworks with cultural annotations, proposed different negotiation structures for different partner groups, and set the standard that no clause would be sent without understanding how it would be read through dignity, authority, and trust. At Northbridge, I had squeezed those details into document margins so no one would complain that the briefing was too long. At Virion, they became core. My title was also clear: Amelia Brooks. Strategic Liaison, listed directly on partner documents. No vice president prefix to make it look important. No committee filter between me and the work. Just my name, my responsibility, and enough authority to do what I said was necessary. When Kareem's office reached out again, they did not ask whether I was returning to Northbridge. They asked whether I would lead the next joint development round with Virion. I said yes. In that moment, I understood something. Sometimes a career does not advance because someone raises your chair in the old room. Sometimes it begins when you leave that room without looking back. Northbridge still tried to enter the Gulf market as if everything had only been delayed. The last proposal I heard about was sent without a named relationship lead. Only the company logo stretched across 5 slides. A tidy list of deliverables. And several generic promises about global capability. No context. No assurance. No voice the partner could remember. The response came back in 2 polite sentences. They appreciated the submission, but could not proceed without cultural assurance. That was their gentle way of saying a hard truth. We do not trust you. Not without her. Not without Amelia. I read the forwarded note someone from the old company sent me. And this time, it did not hurt the way it once might have. There was a time when I wanted Northbridge to understand I was never just a role. I was never only a small title on an internal chart. I was the conversation before the contract. The pause between 2 decisions. The voice partners remembered when choosing between companies that looked identical on paper. Northbridge never understood that because it believed too deeply in its own structure. They thought trust could be reassigned like a shared folder. They thought replacing me meant finding someone younger, cheaper, and louder in meetings. But trust is not transferable. It is accumulated every time you keep your word. Every time you refuse to sacrifice nuance for speed. Every time you choose respect over convenience. I never needed to expose them publicly. I did not leak the story. I did not write a long post claiming credit. I simply kept working. And every new agreement I guided became quiet proof that what they lost had never been excess headcount. Their mistake followed them, not because I chased them, but because consequences have better endurance than anger. Some people later asked whether I felt satisfied watching it happen. The honest answer is not in the way they meant. Satisfaction is hot, fast, and wants an audience. What I felt was colder, more like a truth finally becoming visible. I did not need Northbridge to fail in order to know I had value. I had known that for a long time. Even if exhaustion sometimes made me forget how to say it to myself, my value did not change. What changed was where I placed it. Before, I placed it inside an organization that wanted results but refused to understand process. I let people who never fully read my notes decide the scale of my influence. I accepted having my name placed behind the logo, behind rank, behind people who spoke more and understood less. After that Thursday, I stopped doing that. I began documenting my value more completely. Not to boast, but so no one could reduce it to a cost line again. I maintained relationships through respect. Not business cards. I stated boundaries clearly. Not to perform toughness, but to prevent my skill from being consumed without limit. At Virion, I relearned what it felt like to be asked for input before decisions were already finished. With Gulf partners, I continued doing what I had always done, listening carefully, speaking at the right moment, and keeping my word. The remarkable thing was that the world outside Northbridge did not need long to understand. When a new company entered the region and asked about strategic credibility, the first question was no longer only about software features. They asked who was handling the relationship, and more often now, the answer is Amelia Brooks. Not because I became louder, because when a person builds long enough in silence, eventually the structure speaks for her. I think the largest lesson was not that Northbridge lost money. Money was only the easiest surface of the mistake to measure. What they truly lost was the right to be trusted. And in cross-cultural business, losing the right to be trusted is more expensive than any single contract. Some people at my old company probably tell the story in ways that make them less uncomfortable. They may say the market shifted. The partner was difficult. Timing was unfavorable. Or the restructuring process created disruption. They may place everything inside vague phrases so no one has to face the truth. But the truth is simple: they removed the person who held the context, then acted surprised when the context disappeared. They removed the person who carried trust, then acted surprised when trust did not follow the logo. They removed a woman who had spent years doing work that did not receive applause, then acted surprised when the only applause left was the sound of partners closing the door behind them. I am no longer bitter about that, because bitterness is a kind of tether. It keeps you tied to the room that hurt you. I chose something else: distance. Distance to see clearly, to grow, to stop returning to the version of myself that kept trying to prove herself to people who did not want to see. Forgiveness, in some cases, can heal, but not every bridge deserves to be rebuilt. Some bridges burn not to leave you alone, but to prevent you from walking back to a place that made you smaller. I do not hate Northbridge. I simply no longer belong to them. That difference matters. Hatred means you are still being pulled. Not belonging means you are free. And freedom, when it finally arrives, is quieter than revenge but far more permanent. If my story can speak to anyone out there, I hope it says this: do not wait until someone needs you before you believe you have value. Do not let a title decide the size of your capability. Do not let a room full of silent people convince you that their silence proves you are unimportant. Maybe you have been the person doing the work. No one sees the one connecting relationships, fixing errors before they become crises, remembering details the team forgot, staying calm while others compete for presentation time. Maybe you were replaced by someone brighter on paper, cheaper on payroll, or easier to control inside the system. And maybe, after you left, things began to crack. If that happens, remember, you do not need to return just to prove them wrong. Your absence has already done that. What you need is to keep building. But this time with clarity. Write down the skills no one can fake in you. Protect the relationships built on real trust, not just work email. Update your profile, portfolio, and professional story without shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. Tell the truth about your role fully and accurately. Do not exaggerate, but do not erase yourself either. The world often teaches women to be so modest that they disappear, then act surprised when they are not recognized. I disappeared from Northbridge in one morning, but I did not disappear from my own value. That was the part they could not control. The same is true for you. You are not invisible. You may simply be standing in a room too small for what you carry. And sometimes the most strategic thing you can do is stop asking that room to expand. Then walk out and build where your full weight is welcome. Now, when I look back, I no longer think of the day I was fired as an ending. It was the day a truth was forced into the open. Before that, I was still trying to negotiate with a system that did not want to learn. I was still patiently explaining things to people who listened with half their attention. I still believed that if I delivered one more strong contract, saved one more difficult negotiation, or wrote one more clear cultural note, perhaps they would finally understand. But understanding cannot be forced into people who benefit from not understanding. Northbridge saw me only when my absence became expensive. By then, I no longer needed their gaze. I continued working with Kareem, with Ethan, and with teams that knew how to ask the right questions before decisions were made. I did not become harder in the sense of losing my softness. I became more precise with my boundaries. I still believe in relationships, promises, and the power of respect built over time, but I no longer give those things to places that treat them as resources to be reassigned. Some names cannot be replaced because history stands behind them. Some bridges, once burned, may be rebuilt, but they will never lead back to the same place. And some women do not need to shout to make an entire system realize they once carried its weight on their shoulders. I am one of them. I did not leave to take revenge. I left to return to myself the life that had been underestimated for too long. Thank you for watching the video until the end. If this story reached you, please leave one like, subscribe to the channel, and remember, sometimes the strongest way to be heard is to stop speaking in a room that does not deserve you. Then build somewhere else until they are forced to say your name more carefully.